On March 17, 2016, Papadopoulos returned to London. 4 days later, candidate Trump publicly named him as a member of the Foreign Policy and National Security Advisory Team chaired by Senator Jeff Sessions, describing Papadopoulos as an, quote, an oil and energy consultant, end quote, and, quote, excellent guy, end quote. On March 24, 2016, Papadopoulos met with Mifsud in London. Mifsud was accompanied by a Russian female named Olga Polonskaya. Mifsud introduced Polonskaya as a former student of his who had connections to Vladimir Putin. Papadopoulos understood at the time that Polonskaya may have been Putin's niece, but later learned that this was not true. During the meeting, Polonskaya offered to help Papadopoulos establish contacts in Russia and stated that the Russian ambassador in London was a friend of hers. Based on this interaction, Papadopoulos expected Mifsud and Polonskaya to introduce him to the Russian ambassador in London, but that did not occur. Following his meeting with Mifsud, Papadopoulos sent an email to members of the Trump campaign's Foreign Policy Advisory Team. The subject line of the message was, quote, meeting with Russian leadership including Putin, end quote. The message stated in pertinent part, I just finished a very productive lunch with a good friend of mine, Joseph Mifsud, the director of the London Academy of Diplomacy, who introduced me to both Putin's niece and the Russian ambassador in London, who also acts as the deputy foreign minister. The topic of the lunch was to arrange a meeting between us and the Russian leadership to discuss U.S.-Russia ties under President Trump. They are keen to host us in a neutral city or directly in Moscow. They said the leadership, including Putin, is ready to meet with us and Mr. Trump should to meet with us and Mr. Trump should there be interest. Waiting for everyone's thoughts on moving forward with this very important issue. Papadopoulos' message came at a time when Clovis perceived a shift in the campaign's approach toward Russia, from one of engaging with Russia through the NATO framework and taking a strong stance on Russian aggression in Ukraine. Grand jury, I already forgot the name of the word, redacted. Clovis's response to Papadopoulos, however, did not reflect that shift. Replying to Papadopoulos and the other members of the Foreign Policy Advisory Team copied on the initial email, Clovis wrote, this is most informative. Let me work it through the campaign. No commitments until we see how this plays out. My thought is that we probably should not go forward with any meetings with the Russians until we have had occasion to sit with our NATO allies, especially France, Germany, and Great Britain. We need to reassure our allies that we are not going to advance anything with Russia until we have everyone on the same page. More thoughts later today. Great work. C. March 31 Foreign Policy Team Meeting. The campaign held a meeting of the Foreign Policy Advisory Team with Senator Sessions and candidate Trump approximately 1 week later on March 31, 2016 in Washington, D.C. The meeting, which was intended to generate press coverage for the campaign, took place at the Trump International Hotel. Papadopoulos flew to Washington for the event. At the meeting, Senator Sessions sat at one end of an oval table while Trump sat at the other, as reflected in the photograph below, which was posted to Trump's Instagram account. Papadopoulos sat between the two seats to Sessions' left. And this is a picture of the table. The caption is March 31, 2016, meeting of foreign policy team with Papadopoulos, fourth from right of candidate Trump. During the meeting, each of the newly announced foreign policy advisors introduced themselves and briefly described their areas of experience or expertise. Papadopoulos spoke about his previous work in the energy sector and then brought up a potential meeting with Russian officials. Specifically, Papadopoulos told the group that he had learned through his contacts in London that Putin wanted to meet with candidate Trump, and that these connections could help arrange that meeting. Trump and Sessions both reacted to Papadopoulos' statement. Papadopoulos and campaign advisor J.D. Gordon, who told investigators in an interview that he had a, quote, crystal clear, end quote, recollection of the meeting, have stated that Trump was interested in and receptive to the idea of a meeting with Putin. Papadopoulos understood Sessions to be similarly supportive of his efforts to arrange a meeting. Gordon and two other attendees, however, recall that Sessions generally opposed the proposal, though they differ in their accounts of the concerns he voiced or the strength of the opposition he expressed. D. George Papadopoulos learns that Russia has, quote, and quote, dirt, end quote, in the form of Clinton emails. Whatever Sessions' precise words at the March 31st meeting, Papadopoulos did not understand Sessions or anyone else in the Trump campaign to have directed that he refrain from making further efforts to arrange a meeting between the campaign and the Russian government. To the contrary, Papadopoulos told the office that he understood the campaign to be supportive of his efforts to arrange such a meeting. Accordingly, when he returned to London, Papadopoulos resumed those efforts. Throughout April 2016, Papadopoulos continued to correspond with, meet with, and seek Russia contacts through Mifsud and, at times, Polanskaya. For example, within a week of her initial March 24th meeting with him, Polanskaya attempted to send Papadopoulos a text message, which email exchanges show to have been drafted or edited by Mifsud, addressing Papadopoulos' wish, quote, wish to engage with the Russian Federation, end quote. When Papadopoulos learned from Mifsud that Polanskaya had tried to message him, he sent her an email seeking another meeting. Polanskaya responded the next day that she was, quote, back in St. Petersburg, end quote, but, quote, would be very pleased to support Papadopoulos' initiatives between our two countries, end quote, and, quote, to meet him again, end quote. Papadopoulos stated in reply that he thought, quote, a good step, end quote, would be to introduce him to, quote, the Russian ambassador in London, end quote, and that he would like to talk to the ambassador, quote, or anyone else you recommend about a potential foreign policy trip to Russia, end quote. Mifsud, who had been copied on the email exchanges, replied on the morning of April 11th, 2016. He wrote, quote, this has already been agreed. I am flying to Moscow on the 18th for a Valdai meeting, plus other meetings at the Duma. We will talk tomorrow, end quote. The two bodies referenced by Mifsud are part of or associated with the Russian government. The Duma is a Russian legislative assembly, while Valdai refers to the Valdai Discussion Club, a Moscow-based group that, quote, is close to Russia's foreign policy establishment, end quote. Papadopoulos thanked Mifsud and said that he would see him, quote, tomorrow, end quote. For her part, Polanskaya responded that she had, quote, already alerted my personal links to our conversation and your request, end quote, that, quote, we are all very excited the possibility of a good relationship with Mr. Trump, end quote, and that, quote, the Russian Federation would love to welcome him once his candidature would be officially announced, end quote. Papadopoulos's and Mifsud's mentions of seeing each other tomorrow referenced a meeting that the two had scheduled for the next morning, April 12, 2016, at the Andaz Hotel in London. Papadopoulos acknowledged the meeting during interviews with the office, and records from Papadopoulos's UK cell phone and his internet search history all indicate that the meeting took place. Following the meeting, Mifsud traveled as planned to Moscow. On April 18, 2016, while in Russia, Mifsud introduced Papadopoulos over email to Ivan Timoviv, a member of the Russian International Affairs Council, RIAC. Mifsud had described Timofeev as having connections with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MFA, the executive entity in Russia responsible for Russian foreign relations. Over the next several weeks, Papadopoulos and Timofeev had multiple conversations over Skype and email about setting, quote, the groundwork, end quote, for a, quote, potential, end quote, meeting between the campaign and Russian government officials. Papadopoulos told the office that on one Skype call, he believed that his conversation with Timofeev was being monitored or supervised by an unknown third party because Timofeev spoke in an official manner and Papadopoulos heard odd noises on the line. Timofeev also told Papadopoulos in an April 25, 2016 email that he had just spoken, quote, to Igor Ivanov, the president of RIAC and former foreign minister of Russia, end quote, and conveyed Ivanov's advice about how best to arrange a, quote, Moscow visit, end quote. After a stop in Rome, Mifsud returned to England on April 25, 2016. The next day, Papadopoulos met Mifsud for breakfast at the Andaz Hotel, the same location as their last meeting. During that meeting, Mifsud told Papadopoulos that he had met with high-level Russian government officials during his recent trip to Moscow. Mifsud also said that, on the trip, he learned that the Russians had obtained, quote, dirt, end quote, on candidate Hillary Clinton. As Papadopoulos later stated to the FBI, Mifsud said that the, quote, dirt, end quote, was in the form of, quote, emails of Clinton, end quote, and that, quote, have thousands of emails, end quote. On May 6, 2016, 10 days after that meeting with Mifsud, Papadopoulos suggested to a representative of a foreign government that the Trump campaign had received indications from the Russian government that it could assist the campaign through the anonymous release of information that would be damaging to Hillary Clinton. E. Russia-related communications with the campaign. While he was discussing with his foreign contacts a potential meeting of campaign officials with Russian government officials, Papadopoulos kept campaign officials apprised of his efforts. On April 25, 2016, the day before Mifsud told Papadopoulos about the emails, Papadopoulos wrote to senior policy advisor Stephen Mueller that, quote, the Russian government has an open invitation by Putin for Mr. Trump to meet him when he is ready, end quote, and that, quote, the advantage of being in London is that these governments tend to speak a bit more openly in neutral cities, end quote. On April 27, 2016, after his meeting with Mifsud, Papadopoulos wrote a second message to Mueller stating that, quote, some interesting messages were coming in from Moscow about a trip when the time is right, end quote. The same day, Papadopoulos sent a similar email to campaign manager Corey Lewandowski, telling Lewandowski that Papadopoulos had, quote, been receiving a lot of calls over the last month about Putin wanting to host Trump and the team when the time is right, end quote. Papadopoulos' Russia-related communications with campaign officials continued throughout the spring and summer of 2016. On May 4th, 2016, he forwarded to Lewandowski an email from Timofeev raising the possibility of a meeting in Moscow, asking Lewandowski whether that was, quote, something we want to move forward with, end quote. The next day, Papadopoulos forwarded the same Timofeev email to Sam Clovis, adding to the top of the email, quote, Russia update, end quote. He included the same email in a May 21, 2016 message to senior campaign official Paul Manafort under the subject line, quote, request from Russia to meet Mr. Trump, end quote, stating that, quote, Russia has been eager to meet Mr. Trump for quite some time and have been reaching out to me to discuss, end quote. Manafort forwarded the message to another campaign official without including Papadopoulos and stated, quote, let's discuss. We need someone to communicate that Trump is not doing these trips. It should be someone low level in the campaign so as not to send any signal, end quote. On June 1, 2016, Papadopoulos replied to an earlier email chain with Lewandowski about a Russia visit, asking if Lewandowski, quote, wanted to have a call about this topic, end quote, and whether, quote, we were following up with it, end quote. After Lewandowski told Papadopoulos to, quote, connect with, end quote, Clovis because he was, quote, running point, end quote, Papadopoulos emailed Clovis that, quote, the Russian MFA, end quote, was asking him, quote, if Mr. Trump is interested in visiting Russia at some point, end quote. Papadopoulos wrote in an email that he, quote, wanted to pass this info along to you for you to decide what's best to do with it and what message I should send or to ignore, end quote. After several email and Skype exchanges with Timofeev, Papadopoulos sent one more email to Lewandowski on June 19th, 2016, Lewandowski's last day as campaign manager. The email stated that, quote, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, end quote, had contacted him and asked whether, if Mr. Trump could not travel to Russia, a campaign representative such as Papadopoulos could attend meetings. Papadopoulos told Lewandowski that he was, quote, willing to make the trip off the record if it's in the interest of Mr. Trump and the campaign to meet specific people, end quote. Following Lewandowski's departure from the campaign, Papadopoulos communicated with Clovis and Walid Fairs, another member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Team, about an off-the-record meeting between the campaign and Russian government officials, or with Papadopoulos' other Russia connections, Mifsud and Timofeev. Papadopoulos also interacted directly with Clovis and Fairs in connection with the summit of the Transatlantic Parliamentary Group on Counterterrorism, TAG, a group for which Fairs was co-secretary general. On July 16, 2016, Papadopoulos attended the TAG summit in Washington, D.C., where he sat next to Clovis, as reflected in the photograph below.